So yeah, just to introduce myself, my name is Kamran Yunus. I'm an admissions tutor at Downing College. So just to quickly talk about what an admissions tutor is. At Cambridge, all the undergraduate admissions is actually administered by the colleges. So every college makes decisions about which students will come and study a particular subject at their college. And an admissions tutor role is to kind of oversee that process. So my role as an admissions tutor at Downing is to kind of oversee all the undergraduate admissions at the college and make sure all the decisions that we make for all our applicants are done fairly. So I have to make the decisions ultimately about who gets a place, and I have to navigate through those discussions with my colleagues for the various subjects when we receive applications. So that's my role as an admissions tutor. And what I want to do in this sort of short session is really talk about the undergraduate admissions process and kind of talk through the main stages of how you'd go about preparing for an application to Cambridge and the sorts of things you need to think about when preparing your application to the university. So as I go through these slides, I can see that there's a chat feature there. If people do have questions, please post them on the chat and I'll try and answer as many of the questions. So the application process. So what I've tried to do in this slide here is really kind of break down the application process into a number of stages. And the key things you need to think about when preparing an application to Cambridge. So the first thing I've written here, if you look at the first point, it says choose your course. And that's very, very important. I know everyone on this call here is joining this call because they're all very interested in medicine, but make sure you really, really think hard about the subject you want to study at university and really make an informed decision about what is it you want to study at university. As an academic, I've been working at Cambridge for nearly 20 years. A number of times I've come across students who start a course and then after the first year realize that they want to change course. And that can be quite a stressful process. So medicine is something which is quite a long-term commitment. It's a career choice. So please do think about this carefully and make sure that it's really what you want to do. Now, when you have made your mind up, and hopefully all of you on this call have already done that, the next thing you need to be thinking about when preparing an application to Cambridge is to think about the college you're going to apply to. So as I mentioned before, all the undergraduate admissions are administered by individual colleges. So applications are received by a college and then the college process their applications and make a decision about whether they would like to offer the student a place to study a particular subject at their college. So it's really important to think about which college you want to apply to. Now, a lot of students will ask, how do I choose a college? And my advice to anyone when thinking about picking a college is to have your own criteria. Make your own list of all the key things you would like the college to provide for you, and then go around and have a look at all the colleges and see which college is the best fit for you. Now, this criteria could be, does it have a good accommodation? Does it have good food? Does it have the sports facilities I'm interested in? Is the location close to the faculty where I'm going to be doing most of my studies? Is it a small college? Is it a large college? Does it have a big student community? You know, does it have a small student community? All of these things are quite personal preferences. And I would suggest anyone who's preparing to apply to Cambridge is to have your own checklist and then go and visit some of the colleges and see which college sort of ticks all the boxes for you. At the end of the day, you're going to spend 3, 4, well, 5 years at that college studying. So make sure you do your homework to really pick the college which would be a good fit for you. All the colleges are very unique. They have quite a different flavor in terms of student experience. So it's really important that you do your homework and look into the college and research it. In terms of academic experience, one thing that I need to just emphasize is the experience that students have is completely identical. All your lectures, all your practicals, all your assessments are done at the faculty. So everyone, no matter which college you go to, will have that same experience. And all the teaching you get and the support you get for the teaching will be the same. So in terms of academic experience, no matter which college you go to, they will be identical. So it's really down to a personal choice. Now, having said all of that, many applicants, don't want to have the hassle of picking a college in which case you can make an open application to university. And what that means is your application is randomly allocated to a particular college to review. And from an admissions tutor's point of view, it doesn't make a difference to me if a student's applied to me directly or through an open application process. Their application will be processed and reviewed in the same way. So think about when you're applying to university, think about college choices and see if that's something that you want to do some homework on. Now, there have been some university open days in July, and I presume many of you on this call probably came to the open days, have a look around colleges. There will be another open day happening in September again. For those which didn't get a chance to come in July, I'll encourage you to come along to the university open days and have a look around the colleges in leading up to the application deadline. Now, the other thing is when you're preparing your application, you need to think about specific deadlines for the application process. Now, anyone applying for medicine would have to sit an admissions test, which is BMAT. And there is a registration deadline for BMAT, which is coming up quite soon. So please do go to the university website, look up the deadlines for registering for this, for the BMAT test, and make sure you register in time. If you miss the registration deadline for any of these admissions assessments, then your application will be invalid. So you must make sure that you register for BMAT if you're applying for medicine. The other thing to note is the UCAS deadline is the 15th of October, and this is a lot earlier than other universities. So make sure you start preparing your application from now. Really start thinking about the types of things you need to put in your application. For example, your personal statement, because you should be reviewing this at school in September when your schools start, and really getting your application to the point where it's ready to submit before the middle of October. So it's really important to make sure you understand these deadlines and make sure you get your application submitted within these deadlines. If you don't register for the test or don't submit your application by the 15th of October, your application will be invalid and will not be considered at the university. So it's important to bear this in mind. The other thing to think about as part of the application is that what will happen is once we've received your application on the 15th of October, we will be getting in touch with you to ask you to complete an additional questionnaire. Now, a number of students get quite stressed about this and think this is another form of assessment. And I can't emphasize enough that this is really us trying to gather more information about you as an applicant. UCAS applications provide a certain level of detail, but at Cambridge, we would like to know a lot more details about the applicant. For example, in the additional questionnaire, we will ask you to provide information about what topics you've covered as part of your A-level course. And that then gets added to your application. And if you are invited for an interview, this information is very useful for the interviewers, because then they can see what sort of topics you've learned so far in your A-level course, and then can base some of their questions, which will be academic questions in the interview, around previous gained knowledge. So don't stress about this additional questionnaire. It's us just gathering further information. Another thing in the additional questionnaire that we ask for is any kind of extenuating circumstances. So if you are an applicant who's had their academic studies impacted due to some unforeseen circumstances, then it's really important that you get support from your school to complete the extenuating circumstances form, which can provide us information about what's happened, what are your current circumstances which are impacting your studies. Point number 6 really doesn't really apply to medicine. And this is really for subjects which are sort of for the arts and humanities, where we may ask for submitted written work, some essays that you've done at school. But from the case of medicine, this doesn't really apply. Now, once we've received your application and all the additional questionnaire, and we've reviewed your BMAT scores, once you've sat your test in early November, we will then be starting to draw up a short list of applicants that we want to consider for an interview. And candidates are normally informed by the end of November about whether they've been shortlisted for an interview. And the interviews would normally take place in the first 2 or 3 weeks of December, where applicants will be interviewed at the college that they've applied for. Now, depending at the college you've applied to, you may have one, you may have two, or you may have three interviews. So again, look at the individual college that you're applying to, look at the application sort of requirements for that college, and they should have information about what sort of things will happen as part of the application process for that college. Now, once the interviews are happened in December, we then review all the interview reports and the scores for the interviews that each interviewer gives you. And then in early January, we then make a decision about which applicants we would like to shortlist for an offer, and decision letters are sent out by the middle of January to all the applicants. So hopefully in this slide here, what I've been able to do is summarize the steps involved in preparing your application to the university and sort of key timelines of what will happen when and when to expect to hear from the university or the college that you've applied to. So the other question that lots of candidates ask us is, what sort of information do we use to assess your application? Now, what I've tried to do in this slide here is sort of list out all the different things that we review as part of your application. The key thing we look at is academic records, for example. What have you achieved so far in your academic studies? So, for example, what are your grades in your GCSE? We also look at your personal statement, read about what is it that specifically fascinates you about the subject you applied to, and what are the key reasons that you are thinking of studying a particular subject at university. We'll also be looking at your teacher's reference and seeing what the teacher has to say about you. And really, we're looking for information about why this candidate is such an outstanding candidate and is someone that should be considered by the university for a place. As well as this, admissions test results are also important. And as I mentioned, for medicine, it's BMAT, and we'll be looking at how you performed in the test. Now, to be very straight with you, medicine is a subject which is numbers managed. So we have a quota provided to us by the government, and every college then has an individual quota, which then comes together to make the overall quota for the university. Now, when colleges are reviewing applicants, they need to make sure that the applicants that they're considering for a place to study at the university are competitive against the gathered field. And this is why we do the BMAT test. And that way we can compare our applicants against all the other applicants which apply to other colleges. So once you sit your BMAT test, the key thing to bear in mind is that you need to perform to a very competitive level. And normally applicants which are within the top 20 percentile, so the top 20% are good in terms of their scores for BMAT, which is comparable against the gathered field at the university, are the ones which will then be considered further when we are shortlisting for interviews. Having said that, that's not a hard and fast rule. Other information is used before as well as part of our process to do selections. Now, written work doesn't apply to medicine because this is only for subjects which are for arts and humanities, but the extenuating circumstance is another thing which is quite important. And we will look at any extenuating circumstances that applicants have had and really take that into consideration as part of our review and assessment of their application. And the last point here is interviews. We look at how you've performed at the interview, what the interviewer has to say about you, and what sort of score they've given you at the interview. Now, all of these aspects, all these sort of factors are considered as part of your application. But the key thing I want to try and emphasize here is we don't take any one of these factors and consider them in isolation. We look at all of these factors together in combination and really take a holistic approach in making our decision about each application. And so the key thing to remember is when we are reviewing applications, we're considering each applicant on an individual basis. Now, to kind of explain what that statement means, I could have an applicant who has an outstanding academic track record, fantastic personal statement, very good teacher's reference, and then haven't had a very good BMAT score. That doesn't mean that they won't be shortlisted for an interview, because we'll look at all the other factors and think, well, this candidate does look like a very capable student. Maybe they didn't have a good day when they sat their BMAT. Maybe it's still worth inviting for them for an interview. And you may be shortlisted still for an interview. And when you come for the interview, if you do a very outstanding, if you perform very well at the interview and come across as a very competitive applicant, your application still may be considered for a place. So hopefully that gives you an idea that we look at all of these factors when we're assessing applications, and not one of these takes precedent over another one. They're all looked at together holistically, and for each application, we try and review them on an individual basis. There's no hard and fast rule that we apply to applicants and when we're doing our selection process. The other question that you might be thinking about is, what are we looking for when we're reviewing applications? And I've got to be very blunt and straight about this. We are looking for academic ability and potential. We want to make sure that the applicants we shortlist for an offer are those which are going to be very, very good academically. The key things is we want to make sure that they are suitable for the chosen course, have a genuine interest in the subject area, are enthusiastic, motivated, and dedicated in wanting to study that subject at university. And in the case of medicine, we're looking for students which are very, very bright, are going to be able to cope with the academic pace of the work at Cambridge, but at the same time, have the right aptitude to become a good doctor. So those are the sorts of things we're looking for. The sorts of things we're not really interested in is any kind of extracurricular activities. So if you play for the under 18 England football team, this is the example I always use, that has no bearing on your application. It's great that you're taking part in a competitive sport and you're doing very well. It shows your competitive nature. However, it doesn't form any part of your application to the university. Also, the things like your school background, your background or your school has no relevance to your application. We are purely reviewing your application on academic merit alone, and that's the key thing that we're going to be assessing you for when we are reviewing your application. Now, you probably already had a bit of discussion around personal statements and interviews, but I just wanted to touch on this. It's very important that applicants spend time writing their personal statements. Personal statement, really, the name gives it away. It is a statement that you provide as an individual. When we're reviewing applications, we're looking at hundreds of applicants. And when we're trying to assess these applicants, they all are very competitive, all have done very well academically. And the personal statement is the first time we get an insight of them as an individual. So it's very important that you spend time thinking about how you put your personal statement together. My advice to anyone putting the personal statement together is to keep it direct, keep it to the point, and talk about things that you are passionate about. Talk about things that you want to tell us. Don't think too much about what you think the reader would want to read about. Talk about things that you want to tell us about yourself. And so the sorts of things we're looking for in a personal statement is academic ability and potential. We want to be able to extract that sort of information from the personal statement. We also want to be able to see good evidence of motivation, suitability for the course, and really how committed you are and what sort of to the discipline that you have, what sort of level of commitment do you have. And those sorts of things are really important and what should come across in your personal statement. So when you're putting a personal statement together, keep it specific, give specific evidence and examples, show that you've thought about your course beyond the school curriculum at A-level. So talk about the sorts of things you've done to really broaden your context around the subject area. And in medicine, a lot of students go on and do a lot of work experience, vocational work, which then shows their level of commitment and how they broaden their understanding around becoming a doctor and what the discipline involves. The last thing I'd say about personal statement is to keep it quite specific to academic content. So try and write mostly about academic things in your personal statement. So 2/3 of it should be based around your subject area that you're interested in, but do spend a bit of time talking about extracurricular activities at the end, because this is the same personal statement which we use for all your other applications to other universities. And there, extracurricular activities does have an important role. Now, preparing your personal statement, there's a number of things you can do. And one of the key things that I always emphasize to applicants is think about supercurricular activities. Read around your subject area, The British Medical Journal, for example, is a good example of what you could be doing to read around the subject area. And what that does is broaden your knowledge. So what are you learning at school in your A-level subjects? You can see how that's being applied in a much more broader context in different applications. And that's the sort of connectivity we would like students to make, is to be able to think out the box, have a broader context around the subject area. So reading around your subject area is very important, and supercurricular activities is the best way to try and broaden your context around your subject area. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about in these slides before I could take any questions is the interview process. You know, when you are preparing your application to university, one of the key stages that happens at the end is the interview. These are normally taking place in the first 2-3 weeks of December. And depending on the college you apply to, you may have 1, 2, or 3 interviews with that college. Key thing to notice is that all the interviews will be around academic discussion and be focused around the subject area. And they will be roughly about 20 to 30 minutes long, but that can vary from college to college. What to expect at an interview? Well, what will be happening at the interview is an academic discussion. They may pick out something from your personal statement and have a much more detailed discussion about that. They may look at something you've written in your personal statement about some wider reading and have a discussion around that. They may present you with some visual props. In this picture, you can see this is what would sometimes happen in an interview for someone who's applying for veterinary medicine, where they may put some sort of animal skulls in front of you and discuss some of the features on the skull and try and identify whether the animal is a predator or not. It's just one example. So the key thing is you need to understand is the interviews are designed to engage you in an academic discussion. They're not there to try and catch you out and sort of see if you fall into a trap and not be able to answer a question. They're really there to engage you into a discussion. You have to remember, when you are invited for an interview, you already gone through a competitive selection process, and we're really interested in you. And so what we want to do at the interview is engage you into a discussion. And it's more like a supervision, a tutorial class, where we present you with a question, we try and see how you can answer the question. We then present you with some further information, some hints, some props, and we really want to see how you take the information given to you, put it together to try and work through a problem given to you. So the key thing is, it's not about seeing how fast you get to an answer. It's the thought process you take, the journey you take in trying to solve that problem. And that gives us an insight into how teachable you are, how able are you into taking information and processing it, how able you are in being able to work independently, and really gives us an insight into, are you going to be someone who's going to be able to cope with the teaching style at the University of Cambridge. So just to kind of emphasize, and last thing is, what are we looking for? You know, like I've mentioned here already, but it's about assessing your ability to comprehend information given to you and judge your aptitude to learning about new concepts or topics. So key things what should come across in your interview is your independent thinking, ability to critically analyze information, and presentation of your own interpretation and opinions about certain subject areas as well. Okay, so I mean, I've tried to keep this presentation brief because I was hoping that you guys would have lots of questions that you would want to ask. So try and keep the discussion around trying to answer as many questions as possible. So I hope there are some questions here for me. Okay, so I can see there's some questions here in the chat. McKay, would you like me to just work through these questions?
Yeah, if you've got questions in the chat directly to you, feel free to just work through them.
Yeah. So I'd say there's a question now. I understand each college has its own admissions process and preference. I personally am set on Downing. Oh, that's very kind of good to hear. I love most of the aspects of the college after visiting and reading about it. Is there anything in the application that Downing specifically prefer to give more importance to? There isn't. I mean, every college, the one thing you have to know that the application process and the admissions process across colleges is very, very consistent. We all look for the same type of information, that we all trying to assess the applicants in a very similar way. So when you're preparing an application, the key thing, like I've mentioned, is think about your personal statement, think about those key things I've mentioned about in your personal statement. try and read around your subject area to broaden your context around the subject area, because that will really help you in an interview. You know, being able to think about how something you've learned at school applies to a certain application in a broader context is the sort of scenarios that you will come across in an interview. They'll be presenting you with a problem that you've not seen before and seeing how you take knowledge you've learned through from school and apply it to solve this problem. So lots of, if you can read around your subject area and focus on doing supercurricular activities, this would really help you with your application. So those are the key things that I would emphasize for anyone who's preparing their application to university. Okay, is this questionnaire the SAQ at Cambridge? Yes, so the questionnaire that I've mentioned, it used to be called a supplementary additional questionnaire. It's being renamed, so it's basically, it's what the SAQ used to be. So yeah, and we tried to gather further information about applicants through this additional questionnaire. Even things like your data about your school, you know, any contextual information. This is where we gather that information, so we can actually review that as part of your application. Another question here, is the application process in year 12 or in year 13? The application process takes place at the beginning of year 13. So applicants who've just finished year 12, after their summer vacation, will be preparing their application at the beginning of year 13 as soon as they start their year 13 course. Okay, so I can see, so there's some questions there. So there's another one here. Do interviewers look out for social skills, and to what extent? That's a good question. And what we look for in social skills, I wouldn't call it social skills. I would call it more interpersonal skills. What we're looking for is people who are going to be good doctors. So having good communication skills, having good people skills is very important to anyone who is thinking of becoming a doctor. So those sorts of things are ones that we are also going to be, those sorts of things we are trying to review when we're interviewing applicants. Another question here, would it be better as a graduate to apply for the undergraduate course or the undergraduate course if A levels are lower than expected due to mitigating circumstances? Okay, so my advice to this person who's asked this question is to get in touch with the college you're thinking of applying to and really talk about your personal circumstances in more detail with the college and get some advice from them on this. Extenuating circumstances are taken into consideration. So if there is an applicant who has had their academic studies impacted due to personal circumstances, then that should be discussed with the individual college. So my advice to you is to get in touch with the college and talk to them, the one that you're thinking of applying to, and then see what they would suggest and really take that discussion up with them. Another question here, will GCSE grades from 2021 cohort be taken into account? I understand that some universities will not be doing this. So this is a good question. Our entry requirement is 3 A levels with 2 A stars and an A. It does not mention anything about GCSE grades. We do look at GCSE grades, but as I mentioned, we look at a number of other factors. And we do recognize that many candidates are students which excel later on after they finish their GCSEs. So your grades are important, but they're not a deal breaker. So if you're someone who hasn't performed very well in their GCSEs, but is now doing very well in their A levels, and their school reference and their predicted grades shows that, and if they go on and do very well in the BMAT test, then that kind of shows a lot more. Gives us a lot more information to work with. So don't worry too much about the GCSE grades. If you're someone who is doing very well academically now, you should still consider putting your application forward and don't feel that you would be disadvantaged. Another question, would an A in chemistry, A star in maths, biology and psychology, and an average GCSE grade still have a chance at being accepted? Of course. I mean, if you've already achieved the 2 A stars and an A, which is the standard entry requirements, And as long as you've done A-level chemistry as one of your A-levels, your application meets our entry requirements and therefore would be considered. And as I've mentioned already, we look at a number of other factors. So how you perform at interview, how you perform at your BMAT test, what does your school have to say about you? All of these other things will also be considered as part of the application. I'm going to be very honest, the majority of our applicants achieve 2 A stars and an A or higher than that. And majority of them, there are quite a few of them which were actually doing 4 A levels as well. So, this is one factor which is really good, but it's not the only factor, because there are a number of other things that we need to try and consider to try and differentiate between our candidates, because they're all of very similar caliber when it comes to achieved grades and predicted grades in their A levels. Another question here: are there any things that would make you instantly accept the student factors you are looking for? Well, that's a hard question. I mean, my answer to that is not going to be very straightforward. As I mentioned before, there's a number of things we look at. And if you're looking at all those factors, if you tick every single box on that list, then you would be someone who would come across as extremely competitive. So yes, think about all those things I've mentioned about what sort of things we review as part of assessing your application, and make sure you can demonstrate that you're competitive in all those sort of areas. Another question: dear Dr. Yunus, what would you advise us to do in our gap year if we take one? And does that put us in any advantage or disadvantage? A number of students do apply for after they've taken a gap year. That's absolutely fine. The key thing I would advise anyone who's planning to take a gap year is try and make sure that they do some sorts of activities and work which relates to the discipline. So try and get some opportunity to do some work experience, which would help you reinforce your understanding around what it is it involves in being a doctor, and really help you come to a firm decision about why you want to study medicine at university. And the other thing is, if during your gap year, keep up with your academic work, because the BMAT test you would have to sit after taking a gap year will impact your performance. So make sure you are brushed up on all your academic studies. Another number of students apply, and just sort of extending on that question, for deferred entry, and that's absolutely fine. So if you're applying and you want to take a gap year and like to have a deferred entry, that's absolutely fine as well. But in this case, what I would advise you to do is to really make sure that your application stands out. You need to perform at a very high level at BMAT. You need to do very well in your interviews in order for a college to consider you for a deferred entry. Because when we are looking at deferred entry offers, we are taking up a place that we would give to an applicant who applies in the following admission cycle. So we need to feel confident that the applicant that we're giving a deferred offer to would be the top of our picking order, even if we had another round of applications in the following year. So you need to make sure, if you are applying for deferred entry, that you're someone who is going to have a very competitive application. Another question: how would you recommend making published scientific journals more accessible to read at our stage in learning? That's an extremely good question here, because many of these journals won't be accessible for you. My advice to this question is I would recommend that you type in Google supercurricular activities, Cambridge University. It will take you to a website which has an interactive PDF document. And if you click on medicine, there's a number of links with websites and resources that will be accessible for you. And I would use that as a starting point to start reading around your subject area in a more broader context. Another question: I'm writing an essay based on early cancer intervention. Do you think this is a good supercurricular activity to include in my personal statement? Definitely. I would talk about that in your personal statement. The key thing is, in your personal statement, a number of people, when you see an applicant who's applying for, say, for for natural sciences, they would say, I love chemistry and I've read all these books and list out a number of books, which is great, shows they've really read around the subject area, but it doesn't give us an insight about what they've learned. What is more useful is if they pick one of the books, talk about it, tell us what they've read, what did they take away from that experience, and how that's led to them making a decision to study natural sciences at university. That's much more informative. In the same way, if you are doing a research topic on cancer intervention, early cancer intervention, and writing an essay on this, talk about that. Talk about what you've learned from that experience and how that's really fascinated you about medicine as a discipline, and what is it you've taken away from that experience. And those sorts of things are really useful to read, because that gives us an insight into you and what are the key things that have motivated you about the subject. Is there anything specific international applicants could do to boost their application? If you're an international applicant, you're actually in a much more difficult situation, because the numbers of allocations we have for international students is capped as well. And so you really need to stand out. Your BMAT scores needs to be outstanding. Your performance at your interview needs to be outstanding. Your achieved academic grades and your predicted academic grades need to really stand out, because those are the type of applicants from overseas which will end up having an offer from Cambridge. Would you say an EPQ is more beneficial for medicine than further maths as an A-level? Well, that's a very hard question. If you are someone who is able to take up 4 A-levels, and you have the opportunity to do it and you can keep up with the workload, I will always recommend that, because what that's doing is putting you through an academic pace at a much higher level. So you are going to be working much more harder. And all that's going to do is prepare you for university life, because once you reach university, your academic workload is only going to go up. So if you have an opportunity to do a 4th A-level, definitely do it. But at the same time, doing an EPQ isn't a good example of a supercurricular activity. And if you have the opportunity of doing that, definitely think about doing an EPQ. But whether you have to choose between an EPQ and an A-level, well, that's a very hard choice. And I can't really answer that question for you. It's really down to you as an individual. Which one do you think is going to be one that you're going to excel more at, and pick that as your chosen sort of route and option. Okay, tell me when to stop. I don't know when my time's up. I'll just keep going.
Yeah, if you can make this the last question, if that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, wonderful.
In an interview, if they give you a scenario to solve, can you ask for a few seconds to think about it, or does it have to be spontaneous? This is a very good question. I'm going to just be very honest about this. An interview isn't about setting you up to fail. The interview is to engage you in a discussion. So think out loud, take your time, think about the problem, ask questions if you're not sure about anything. Don't think this is like you get asked a question and you need to answer it as quickly as possible and get the answer right. You know, most of the time, well, all the time, you'll be presented with questions and scenarios that you've not come across before. And it's really about engaging in a discussion and breaking it down and seeing how you can work through the problem is what we're really interested in trying to assess. The last thing I want to make a point about is that many of you will have 2 interviews or maybe 3. And after many applicants, if you speak to undergraduates who are successful applicants who are studying at the university, they will tell you when they came out of their interviews, they felt that was a really difficult interview, and it was like going 10 rounds with Muhammad Ali in the boxing ring. But just because you've had a difficult interview doesn't mean you've had a bad interview. It could be you've having a very good interview. So anyone in that scenario, after you've had your first interview, don't overanalyze it, reset and go in and give your best for your second interview. Just because you feel that your first interview was very difficult doesn't mean you performed badly at that interview. I can see there's lots more questions here. I'm really sorry. I think we're out of time here. But my last bit of advice, if you have questions about the application process, get in touch with the college you're thinking of applying to. The admissions team there will help you and answer any questions you have.